The invitation to the Morgan Foundation's annual gala arrived in an envelope of thick cream-colored paper, gold embossing catching the late afternoon sun. Dr. Katherine Morgan held it between her fingers, considering how something so elegant could feel so much like a declaration of war. "Another one?" Michael asked from the doorway of her office at Boston General, already knowing the answer. Her chief of staff had been with her through every battle in this long, quiet war. "Elizabeth never misses an opportunity," Katherine replied, placing the invitation on her desk next to the latest grant rejection letter from the Morgan Foundation. Especially now. The timing wasn't coincidental. In 3 months, the Morgan Foundation would announce its new director, succeeding Katherine's father, James Morgan, who had led the organization for 4 decades. By all rights, the position should have gone to Katherine. She'd spent her entire career preparing for it, earning her MD, PhD, building a renowned research center, carrying on her father's legacy of innovative medical research. But Elizabeth had other plans. Elizabeth Morgan, Katherine's stepmother, younger than her by 5 years, and the woman who'd spent the last decade systematically dismantling everything Katherine had built. "You could skip it," Michael suggested, though they both knew she wouldn't. Couldn't. And give her the satisfaction. Katherine shook her head, her dark hair catching the light. At 45, she still carried herself with the same determination that had driven her through medical school, through her residency, through building the Morgan Center for Innovative Medicine from the ground up. "No, I'll be there." Front row, smiling, just like always. Just like she'd smiled at her father's wedding 12 years ago, watching a woman barely older than herself take her mother's place. Just like she'd smiled when Elizabeth had begun reorganizing the foundation's priorities, gradually steering funding away from Katherine's research into regenerative medicine. Just like she'd smiled every time Elizabeth had introduced her at foundation events as James's daughter rather than Dr. Morgan, subtly undermining her professional accomplishments. Besides, Katherine continued, picking up the rejection letter, "I think it's time we stopped playing defense." Michael raised an eyebrow. He'd known Katherine long enough to recognize that tone. "What did you find?" Instead of answering directly, Katherine pulled up a file on her computer. "Do you remember the Winters Institute scandal from 5 years ago? The research center in Seattle? They were shut down after that controversy about misappropriated funds." Katherine nodded. "I've been doing some digging. It seems Elizabeth was on their board of directors at the time. She resigned just 2 weeks before the scandal broke. That's convenient timing." "Very." Katherine's fingers danced across her keyboard, pulling up more documents, and it turns out the Winters Institute had some interesting financial connections to a holding company called Azure Ventures. Michael moved closer, scanning the documents on her screen. "Why does that sound familiar?" "Because Azure Ventures just received a $50 million grant from the Morgan Foundation for innovative medical research infrastructure." Katherine's smile was sharp. "The largest grant in the Foundation's history, approved in a closed-door session last month. And you think Elizabeth is connected to Azure?" "I know she is." Katherine pulled up another document. "Azure Ventures is owned by a shell company, which is owned by another shell company, which is ultimately controlled by a trust registered in the Cayman Islands. A trust that was established by one Elizabeth Pierce, her maiden name, 3 months before she married my father." Michael whistled softly. "That's quite a paper trail. How did you find all this?" "I had help." Katherine glanced at her phone. "Remember Angela Chen from Harvard Medical School? She's a forensic accountant now, specializing in nonprofit fraud. She's been helping me connect the dots." "Katherine," Michael's voice held a note of warning. "If you're right about this, it's serious. The Foundation could face federal investigation. Your father's legacy." "My father's legacy is already being destroyed." Katherine cut in, her voice hard. "Elizabeth has been systematically redirecting Foundation funds away from legitimate research and into her own pockets for years. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Before Michael could respond, Katherine's phone buzzed. A text from her father. "Need to see you." "Dinner tonight? Important news." Katherine showed the message to Michael. "Want to bet what this is about?" "The directorship?" She nodded. "Elizabeth's probably convinced him to announce her appointment early. Try to present it as a fait accompli before anyone can raise questions about Azure Ventures." "What are you going to do?" Katherine stood, gathering her things. I'm going to have dinner with my father, and then I'm going to save his foundation from the woman who's been stealing it piece by piece. The Morgan family mansion stood on 5 acres in Brookline, a Victorian masterpiece that had been in the family for 4 generations. Katherine had grown up here, learned to ride her bike in the circular driveway, done her homework in the library where her father now sat in his wheelchair, looking smaller than she remembered. Katie, he smiled, using her childhood nickname. You look tired. Are you working too hard again? Just busy with the new clinical trials, she said, bending to kiss his cheek. She didn't mention that the trials were being funded by private donors because the Morgan Foundation had rejected her grant application. Again. James, darling, don't start lecturing her about work before she's even sat down. Elizabeth swept into the room, elegant as always in a designer dress that probably cost more than most research assistants made in a month. At 40, she still turned heads, something she'd used to her advantage in navigating Boston's philanthropic circles. Katherine, how lovely to see you. I trust you received the gala invitation. Wouldn't miss it, Katherine replied, matching Elizabeth's tone of artificial warmth. Wonderful. It's going to be quite special this year. Lots of big announcements. James cleared his throat. Actually, that's why I wanted to talk to you, Katie. There are some changes coming at the foundation. Katherine listened as her father outlined the future she'd seen coming but had hoped to prevent. Elizabeth would be taking over as director, effective immediately. James would remain as chairman of the board, but in a purely advisory capacity. It's time for new blood, he said, not seeing how Elizabeth's lips curved at the phrase. Fresh perspectives. Elizabeth has some exciting ideas about the foundation's direction. I'm sure she does, Katherine said carefully. Have the board members all signed off on this? We're announcing it at the gala, Elizabeth cut in smoothly. The paperwork is already being processed. I see, Katherine turned to her father. And what about the Azure Ventures grant? Was that one of Elizabeth's exciting new ideas? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Elizabeth's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. James looked confused. The infrastructure development grant? That was thoroughly vetted by the board. Elizabeth recused herself from the vote due to a potential conflict of interest. Did she? Katherine pulled out her phone, pulling up the documents Angela had prepared. And did she mention the nature of that conflict? The fact that she controls Azure Ventures through a series of shell companies. That's ridiculous, Elizabeth snapped, but Katherine could see the flash of fear in her eyes. Is it? Katherine handed her father the phone. It's all there, Dad. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the connection to the Winters Institute scandal. Elizabeth has been using the foundation to funnel money into her own pockets for years. James studied the documents, his face growing increasingly grave. Elizabeth? What is this? Obviously some kind of mistake, Elizabeth said quickly. Katherine has never approved of our marriage. This is clearly an attempt to what? Katherine interrupted. To protect my father's legacy. To prevent you from stealing millions from a charitable foundation. To stop you from destroying everything my parents built. James, Elizabeth turned to her husband, her voice trembling. You can't believe this. After everything we've been through, everything I've done for the foundation. Everything you've done to the foundation, Katherine corrected. The grant rejections for legitimate research, the mysterious funding priorities, the closed-door board meetings. It all leads back to you and your shell companies. James held up a hand, his voice quiet but firm. Elizabeth, is this true? The silence stretched for a long moment. Katherine could almost see the calculations running behind Elizabeth's eyes, looking for a way out, an angle she'd missed. Finally, Elizabeth's posture changed, the vulnerable facade dropping away. You have no idea what it's like, she said, her voice hard. Being the second wife, the younger woman, always living in the shadow of St. Caroline, the brilliant doctor who gave up her practice to run a charitable foundation. Do you know what they call me at fundraisers? The trophy wife, the gold digger. So you decided to prove them right? Katherine asked. I decided to take what I deserved. Elizabeth's composure cracked. I've spent 12 years managing this foundation, modernizing it, while you got to play scientist in your lab. I earned this. You stole it, James said quietly. His face had aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. You stole from me, from the foundation, from the researchers and patients who needed those funds. Dad, Katherine started, but James held up his hand again. Please call Angela Chen, he said, still looking at Elizabeth. Have her bring copies of everything to my office first thing tomorrow. And call Robert, he added, referring to the foundation's legal counsel. He'll need to be there too. James, be reasonable, Elizabeth began, but he cut her off. I think you should pack a bag, he said, his voice tired. Stay at the Four Seasons tonight. We'll discuss separation terms tomorrow after I've reviewed everything. Elizabeth stood very still for a moment, then turned to Katherine. Congratulations, she said, her voice dripping with venom. You finally won. I hope you're happy. This isn't about winning, Katherine replied. It's about doing what's right, something you might want to try sometime. After Elizabeth left, Katherine sat with her father in silence for a long time. Finally, he spoke. I've been a fool. Dad, no. Yes. He wheeled his chair to the window, looking out at the gardens Caroline had loved so much. I let her manipulate me, use the foundation your mother and I built. We can fix it, Katherine said, moving to stand beside him. Angela has detailed records of every transaction. We can recover the funds, restructure the board. You'll have to do it, James interrupted. I'm not. I can't be the public face of this. Not anymore. Katherine knelt beside his chair, taking his hand. We'll do it together. The way it should have been all along. The next few months were a whirlwind of legal meetings, financial audits, and carefully worded press releases. The Morgan Foundation's annual gala was postponed indefinitely. Elizabeth fought the divorce proceedings tooth and nail, but faced with the evidence of her financial misconduct, she eventually settled for a fraction of what she hoped to get. The foundation underwent a complete restructuring. James stepped down as chairman but remained on the board. Katherine was appointed director, though she insisted on maintaining her research role at the hospital. 1 year later, Katherine stood at the podium at a much smaller, more intimate foundation event. The room was filled not with society figures and wealthy donors, but with researchers, doctors, and patients who had benefited from the foundation's work. The Morgan Foundation was built on a simple principle, she began, looking out at the assembled faces. That medical research should serve the greater good, not personal profit. That innovation should be driven by compassion, not greed. In the front row, James sat in his wheelchair, looking more like himself than he had in years. Beside him sat Katherine Morgan's sister, recently appointed to the reconstituted board of directors. Over the past year, we've returned to those principles. We've funded groundbreaking research in regenerative medicine, supported young scientists with innovative ideas, and helped bring life-saving treatments to those who need them most. Katherine paused, looking down at the notes she prepared. Instead of reading them, she spoke from the heart. A foundation, like a family, is built on trust. When that trust is broken, it takes time and effort to rebuild it. But with honesty, integrity, and a commitment to doing what's right, it can be done. Later that evening, Katherine found herself in her father's study, sharing a glass of wine and looking through old family photos. Your mother would be proud, James said, holding a picture of Caroline in her doctor's coat. A young Katherine perched on her desk. Of how you handled everything. Of what you've done with the foundation. I learned from the best, Katherine replied. Both of you. And Elizabeth? Have you heard anything? Katherine nodded. She's in Dubai, apparently, working as a financial consultant. She couldn't quite keep the irony out of her voice. I should have seen it, James said quietly. All those years. Dad, stop. Katherine took his hand. You saw what you wanted to see. We all do sometimes. The important thing is being willing to open our eyes to the truth when it matters. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, looking at the photos spread out before them. 3 generations of Morgans, all dedicated to the same mission of helping others through medical research. You know, James said finally, your mother and I had a saying when we first started the foundation. Truth heals. Katherine smiled. I remember. It was on all the old letterhead. Maybe it's time to bring it back. Katherine thought about the past year, the painful revelations, the difficult decisions, the hard work of rebuilding trust. Truth does heal, she agreed, even when it hurts at first. The next morning, Katherine arrived early at her office in the foundation's headquarters. On her desk sat a stack of new grant proposals, promising research that might never have been funded under Elizabeth's leadership. As she began to read, Katherine thought about legacy, not just her father's or her mother's, but the legacy she was now responsible for building. A legacy based not on deception and personal gain, but on truth, integrity, and the fundamental belief that knowledge and compassion could change the world. She picked up her phone and called Michael. "Remember that idea we had about expanding the clinical trials program? The one Elizabeth shot down. I think it's time to revisit it. Set up a meeting with the research team." As she hung up, Katherine looked at the foundation's new logo on her wall. The traditional Morgan family crest, updated with their restored motto, "Truth Heals." Elizabeth had tried to steal a legacy, but in doing so, she forced them to examine what that legacy truly meant. In the end, the foundation hadn't just survived her betrayal, it had emerged stronger, more focused, more true to its original mission. Sometimes, Katherine reflected, the greatest threats to our foundations, whether professional or personal, force us to rebuild them better than before. The trick is having the courage to face the truth, the wisdom to learn from it, and the strength to use it to heal not just others, but ourselves.